principal component analysis is a statistical procedure that uses an orthogonal transformation to convert a set of observations of possibly correlated variables into a set of values of linearly uncorrelated variables called principal components. The number of principal components is less than or equal to the number of original variables. This transformation is defined in such a way that the first principal component has the largest possible variance, and each succeeding component in turn has the highest variance possible under the constraint that it is orthogonal to the preceding components. The resulting vectors are an uncorrelated orthogonal basis set. PCA is sensitive to the relative scaling of the original variables. PCA was invented in 1901 by Carl Pearson. As an analog of the principal axis theorem in mechanics, it was later independently developed by Harold Hotelling in the 1930s. Depending on the field of application, it is also named the discrete Kosambi-Karhunen-Loève transform in signal processing, the Hotelling transform in multivariate quality control, proper orthogonal decomposition in mechanical engineering, singular value decomposition of X, eigenvalue decomposition of X dx in linear algebra, factor analysis, Eckert-Young theorem, or Schmidt-Mirsky theorem in psychometrics, empirical orthogonal functions in meteorological science, empirical eigenfunction decomposition, empirical component analysis, quasi-harmonic modes, spectral decomposition in noise and vibration, and empirical modal analysis in structural dynamics. PCA is mostly used as a tool in exploratory data analysis and for making predictive models. PCA can be done by eigenvalue decomposition of a data covariance matrix, a singular value decomposition of a data matrix, usually after mean centering the data matrix for each attribute. The results of a PCA are usually discussed in terms of components, sometimes called factor unloadings. PCA is the simplest of the true eigenvector-based multivariate analyses. Often, its operation can be thought of as revealing the internal structure of the data in a way that best explains the variance in the data. If a multivariate dataset is visualized as a set of coordinates in a high-dimensional data space, PCA can supply the user with a lower-dimensional picture, a projection or shadow, of this object when viewed from its most informative viewpoint. This is done by using only the first few principal components so that the dimensionality of the transformed data is reduced. PCA is closely related to factor analysis. Factor analysis typically incorporates more domain-specific assumptions about the underlying structure and solves eigenvectors of a slightly different matrix. PCA is also related to canonical correlation analysis. CCA defines coordinate systems that optimally describe the cross-covariance between two datasets, while PCA defines a new orthogonal coordinate system that optimally describes variance in a single dataset. Intuition. PCA can be thought of as fitting an n-dimensional ellipsoid to the data, where each axis of the ellipsoid represents a principal component. If some axis of the ellipse is small, then the variance along that axis is also small, and by omitting that axis and its corresponding principal component from our representation of the dataset, we lose only a commensurately small amount of information. To find the axis of the ellipse, we must first subtract the mean of each variable from the dataset to center the data around the origin. Then, we compute the covariance matrix of the data and calculate the eigenvalues and corresponding eigenvectors of this covariance matrix. Then, we must orthogonalize the set of eigenvectors and normalize each to become unit vectors. Once this is done, each of the mutually orthogonal unit eigenvectors can be interpreted as an axis of the ellipsoid fitted to the data. The proportion of the variance that each eigenvector represents can be calculated by dividing the eigenvalue corresponding to that eigenvector by the sum of all eigenvalues. It is important to note that this procedure is sensitive to the scaling of the data, and that there is no consensus as to how to best scale the data to obtain optimal results. Further considerations. Given a set of points in Euclidean space, the first principal component corresponds to a line that passes through the multi-dimensional mean and minimizes the sum of squares of the distances of the points from the line. The second principal component corresponds to the same concept after all correlation with the first principal component and has been subtracted from the points. The singular values of the square roots of the eigenvalues of the matrix X dx. Each eigenvalue is proportional to the portion of the variance that is correlated with each eigenvector. The sum of all the eigenvalues is equal to the sum of the squared distances of the points from the multidimensional mean. PCA essentially rotates the set of points around the mean in order to align with the principal components. This moves as much of the variance as possible into the first few dimensions. The values in the remaining dimensions, therefore, tend to be small and may be dropped with minimal loss of information. PCA is often used in this manner for dimensionality reduction. PCA has the distinction of being the optimal orthogonal transformation for keeping the subspace that has largest variance. This advantage, however, comes at the price of greater computational requirements if compared, for example and when applicable, to the discrete cosine transform, and in particular to the dct2, which is simply known as the dct. Nonlinear dimensionality reduction techniques tend to be more computationally demanding than PCA. PCA is sensitive to the scaling of the variables. If we have just two variables and they have the same sample variance and are positively correlated, then the PCA will entail a rotation by 45 degrees and the loadings for the two variables with respect to the principal component will be equal. But if we multiply all values of the first variable by 100, then the first principal component will be almost the same as that variable, with a small contribution from the other variable, whereas the second component will be almost aligned with the second original variable. This means that whenever the different variables have different units, PCA is a somewhat arbitrary method of analysis. Note that Pearson's original paper was entitled On Lines and Planes of Closest Fit to Systems of Points in Space. In space implies physical, Euclidean space where such concerns do not arise. One way of making the PCA less arbitrary is to use variables scaled so as to have unit variance, by standardizing the data and hence use the autocorrelation matrix instead of the autocovariance matrix as a basis for PCA. However, this compresses the fluctuations in all dimensions of the signal space to unit variance. Mean subtraction is necessary for performing PCA to ensure that the first principal component describes the direction of maximum variance. If mean subtraction is not performed, the first principal component might instead correspond more or less to the mean of the data. A mean of 0 is needed for finding a basis that minimizes the mean square error of the approximation of the data. Mean centering is unnecessary if performing a principal components analysis on a correlation matrix, as the data are already centered after calculating correlations. Correlations are derived from the cross product of two standard scores of statistical moments. Also see the article by Cromrie and Amp. Foster Johnson on mean centering in moderated regression. Much ado about nothing. An autoencoder neural network with a linear hidden layer is similar to PCA. Upon convergence, the weight vectors of the k neurons in the hidden layer will form a basis for the space spanned by the first k principal components. Unlike PCA, this technique will not necessarily produce orthogonal vectors. PCA is a popular primary technique in pattern recognition. It is not, however, optimized for class separability. An alternative is the linear discriminant analysis, which does take this into account. Table of symbols and abbreviations. PCA and qualitative variables. In PCA, it is common that we want to introduce qualitative variables as supplementary elements. For example, many quantitative variables have been measured on plants. For these plants, some qualitative variables are available as, for example, the species to which the plant belongs. These data were subjected to PCA for quantitative variables. When analyzing the results, it is natural to connect the principal components to the qualitative variable species. For this, the following results are produced. Identification on the factorial planes of the different species e.g., using different colors. Representation on the factorial planes of the centers of gravity of plants belonging to the same species. For each center of gravity and each axis, p-value to judge the significance of the difference between the center of gravity and origin. These results are what is called introducing a qualitative variable as supplementary element. This procedure is detailed in Anderson, Le and Amp, pages 2009 and pages 2013. Few software offer this option in an automatic way. This is the case of SPAD that historically, following the work of Ludovic Labarthe, was the first to propose this option, and the R package FactMiner. Applications: interest rate derivatives portfolios. Principal component analysis can be directly applied to the risk management of interest rate derivatives portfolios. Trading multiple swap instruments, which are usually a function of 30 to 500 other market quotable swap instruments, is sought to be reduced to usually 3 or 4 principal components, representing the path of interest rates on a macro basis. Converting risks to be represented as those to factor loadings provides assessments and understanding beyond that available to simply collectively viewing risks to individual 30 to 500 buckets. Neuroscience. A variant of principal components analysis is used in neuroscience to identify the specific properties of a stimulus that increase a neuron's probability of generating an action potential. This technique is known as spike-triggered covariance analysis. In a typical application, an experimenter presents a white noise process as a stimulus and records a train of action potentials or spikes, produced by the neuron as a result. Presumably, certain features of the stimulus make the neuron more likely to spike. In order to extract these features, the experimenter calculates the covariance matrix of the spike-triggered ensemble, the set of all stimuli that immediately preceded a spike. The eigenvectors of the difference between the spike-triggered covariance matrix and the covariance matrix of the prior stimulus ensemble then indicate the directions in the space of stimuli along which the variance of the spike-triggered ensemble differed the most from that of the prior stimulus ensemble. Specifically, the eigenvectors with the largest positive eigenvalues correspond to the directions along which the variance of the spike-triggered ensemble showed the largest positive change compared to the variance of the prior. Since these were the directions in which varying the stimulus led to a spike, they are often good approximations of the sought-after relevant stimulus features. In neuroscience, PCA is also used to discern the identity of a neuron from the shape of its action potential. Spike sorting is an important procedure because extracellular recording techniques often pick up signals from more than one neuron. In spike sorting, one first uses PCA to reduce the dimensionality of the space space of action potential waveforms, and then performs clustering analysis to associate specific action potentials with individual neurons. PCA as a dimension reduction technique is particularly suited to detect coordinated activities of large neuronal ensembles. It has been used in determining collective variables, i.e., or order parameters, during phase transitions in the brain. Relation between PCA and k-means clustering. It was asserted that the relaxed solution of k-means clustering, specified by the cluster indicators, is given by the PCA principal components, and the PCA subspace spanned by the principal directions is identical to the cluster centroid subspace. However, that PCA is a useful relaxation of k-means clustering was not a new result, and it is straightforward to uncover counterexamples to the statement that the cluster centroid subspace is spanned by the principal directions. Relation between PCA and factor analysis. Principal component analysis creates variables that are linear combinations of the original variables. The new variables have the property that the variables are all orthogonal. The principal components can be used to find clusters in a set of data. PCA is a variance-focused approach seeking to reproduce the total variable variance, in which components reflect both common and unique variance of the variable. PCA is generally preferred for purposes of data reduction but not when the goal is to detect the latent constructive factors. Factor analysis is similar to principal component analysis in that factor analysis also involves linear combinations of variables. Different from PCA, factor analysis is a correlation-focused approach seeking to reproduce the intercorrelations among variables, in which the factors represent the common variance of variables, excluding unique variance. In terms of the correlation matrix, this corresponds with focusing on explaining the off-diagonal terms, while PCA focuses on explaining the terms that sit on the diagonal. However, as a side result, when trying to reproduce the on-diagonal terms, PCA also tends to fit relatively well the off-diagonal correlations. Results given by PCA and factor analysis are very similar in most situations, but this is not always the case, and there are some problems where the results are significantly different. Factor analysis is generally used when the research purpose is detecting data structure at causal modeling. Correspondence analysis. Correspondence analysis was developed by Jean-Paul Ben-Zakri and is conceptually similar to PCA, but scales the data so that rows and columns are treated equivalently. It is traditionally applied to contingency tables. CA decomposes the chi-squared statistic associated to this table into orthogonal factors. Because CA is a descriptive technique, it can be applied to tables for which the chi-squared statistic is appropriate or not. Several variants of CA are available, including detrended correspondence analysis and canonical correspondence analysis. One special extension is multiple correspondence analysis, which may be seen as the counterpart of principal component analysis for categorical data. Generalizations. Nonlinear generalizations. Most of the modern methods for nonlinear dimensionality reduction find the theoretical and algorithmic roots in PCA or k-means. Pearson's original idea was to take a straight line which will be the best fit to a set of data points. Principal curves and manifolds give the natural geometric framework for PCA generalization and extend the geometric interpretation of PCA by explicitly constructing an embedded manifold for data approximation, and by encoding using standard geometric projection onto the manifold, as it is illustrated by Fig. See also the elastic map algorithm and principal geodesic analysis. Another popular generalization is kernel PCA, which corresponds to PCA performed in a reproducing kernel Hilbert space associated with a positive definite kernel. Multilinear generalizations. In multilinear subspace learning, PCA is generalized to multilinear PCA that extracts features directly from tensor representations. MPCA is solved by performing PCA in each mode of the tensor iteratively. MPCA has been applied to face recognition, gait recognition, etc. MPCA is further extended to uncorrelated MPCA, non-negative MPCA and robust MPCA. Higher order, and way principal component analysis may be performed with models such as Tucker decomposition, PARAFAC, multiple factor analysis, co-inertia analysis, SDATIS, and DISDATIS. Robustness, weighted PCA. While PCA finds the mathematically optimal method, it is sensitive to outliers in the data that produce large errors PCA tries to avoid. It therefore is common practice to remove outliers before computing PCA. However, in some contexts, outliers can be difficult to identify. For example, in data mining algorithms like correlation clustering, the assignment of points to clusters and outliers is not known beforehand. A recently proposed generalization of PCA based on a weighted PCA increases robustness by assigning different weights to data objects based on their estimated relevancy. Robust PCA via decomposition in low-rank and sparse matrices. Robust principal component analysis is a modification of the widely used statistical procedure principal component analysis which works well with respect to grossly corrupted observations. Sparse PCA. A particular disadvantage of PCA is that the principal components are usually linear combinations of all input variables. Sparse PCA overcomes this disadvantage by finding linear combinations that contain just a few input variables. Software source code. Analytica, the built-in eigendecomp function, computes principal components. DataMelt, a Java-free program that implements several classes to build PCA analysis and to calculate eccentricity of random distributions. Elki includes PCA for projection, including robust variance of PCA as well as PCA-based clustering algorithms. Julia supports PCA with the PCA function in the multivariate stats package. KNIME, a Java-based nodal arranging software for analysis. In this the nodes called PCA, PCA compute, PCA apply, PCA inverse make it easily. Mathematica implements principal component analysis with the principal components command using both covariance and correlation methods. MATLAB Statistics Toolbox, the functions princomp and PCA give the principal components, while the function pcares gives the residuals and reconstructed matrix for a low-rank PCA approximation. MLPACK provides an implementation of principal component analysis in C++. NAG library, principal components analysis is implemented via the GEO3AA routine. NMATH, proprietary numerical library containing PCA for the .NET framework. GNU Octave, free software computational environment mostly compatible with MATLAB. The function princomp gives the principal component. OpenCV, Oracle Database 12c implemented via DBMS_data_mining. SVDS_scoring_mode by specifying setting value SVDS_scoring_PCA. Orange integrates PCA in its visual programming environment. PCA displays a scree plot where user can interactively select the number of principal components. Origin contains PCA in its Pro version. Partech Genomics Suite, statistical software able to perform PCA. Clue Core, commercial software for analyzing multivariate data with instant response using PCA. Free statistical package. The functions pringcomp and precomp can be used for principal component analysis. Precomp uses singular value decomposition, which generally gives better numerical accuracy. Some packages that implement PCA in R include, but are not limited to, ADI4, Vegan Exposition, and FactMiner. Scikit-learn, Python library for machine learning which contains PCA, probabilistic PCA, kernel PCA, sparse PCA and other techniques in the decomposition module. Waker, Java library for machine learning which contains modules for computing principal components.